Hello everyone, Kochi here once more, and today we'll be working on a modular curb set. So firstly, why did I choose to make these curbs right now at this time of the project? Well, this comes from the comment I made on the level art time-lapse I've made recently, the second one. On that time-lapse, I've mentioned that since I'm recording everything for YouTube, I am spending more time thinking about my next steps. Because of that, I was thinking a bit on a specific stage of the project on doing level art that I needed to make curbs because at that point I was just making a mesh placeholder geometry for the streets and the sidewalks of my map. And the way I'm doing the art on that map, there's a lot of streets. There's a lot of map that is just covered by streets and sidewalks. And if I'm not having those geometries as final, it kind of makes me uh, uncertain about developing further the art on those places. Like if I need to make a building here on the sidewalk that's near the map, I wanted to first have the final sidewalk geometry because it what if you change the street? What if you change the sidewalk and then the building you've made you have to go and rework it? It makes me uncomfortable. So I realized that I wasn't working on specific things on the map. I was postponing it because I didn't have curbs. It was limiting me at the time. So because of that, I thought, well, let's make these curbs. It will allow me to finish streets, the sidewalks, and then straight up just follow to making out of bounds buildings that are placed on these regions. So that was the decision. And as I'm recording this with hindsight, I can say that it was a good decision. So who knew? If you think about your next steps, if you plan ahead, sometimes, or most often, it will pay out. Of course, you can't just spend all your time planning, but it does help for you to just stop sometimes and think about, am I gonna do this or I'm gonna do that? What makes sense right now? So that was an explanation I found useful for you to be grounded on the context of the project, but now we can actually get to the steps into actually making the model. So the overall process for making these curves was actually quite straightforward. I can say that because over the years, I've done a few Counter-Strike maps, and in those you have access to the library of assets that the default of CS maps have. So across these years, I used a few modular curve sets, and from maps like Nuke, Inferno, and the Dust, and by using those over a few years, it kind of just integrated into my head on at least how modular curve sets are done for Counter-Strike, their dimensions and so on. So by having that in my mind, I didn't actually have to plan much. The actual blockout geometry I did for the curves, those placeholder ones, you might have seen on the level art time lapses, those were actually the actual final dimensions and I didn't need to tweak much. This is a part of the video that I did not record. I missed the recordings of them, so you did not see it. But I basically started the process by picking up those blockout curves and exporting them from the Hammer editor into Blender. So I had the reference to make those curves inside Blender. There aren't many variations in total. I have two curved variations. One is a small curve and one is a longer curve for specific places I already had in the map. And then I did a single straight curve that had 10,024 units of length. And in those 1024 units, I did a multiple splits from, so let's say one 512 section has a few splits that one is like 128, the other is 256, and the other is 128, for example. That makes a 512 one, and it also lets me to split it into a few other ones, as I've mentioned. So in total, I at least have over 10 curbs, and it allows me to have some variation. As I've said before, this map has a lot of streets, so I thought I needed some variations in the curbs. I thought I needed to spend some extra effort in those. So by doing those that length of the curves and that many variations, I required 4K texture map. It's a bit much. I've been using it a few times now on the assets of the map, But so far I've actually not made that many assets, and I've been able to art the map quite a bit of it without needing more assets. So I think so far it's going nicely. And again, the curbs are used kinda everywhere, so I think the resolution so far is fine. But if in any case, I can always go back and lower it if needed and change the way I made it. But so far, I think it works well. So having the shapes of the reference curbs into Blender, I just did some blocks in the shapes that I wanted, and then I did their splits. So as I said before, a 512 one is composed of a few other curbs that I have them combined for the 512, and then there's own split versions for smaller sections or even just for variation. Sometimes I use those smaller pieces for curves as well, some slight curves in the roads. So the shapes were set quite quickly, and then I had a plan to displace those curbs so they had some variation to their shape, some wobbliness, so they weren't just straight blocks. And for that, I needed a texture. So after doing this initial blockouts, I went straight into Designer to make a texture properly made for these curves. One feature that I needed as well that made me go straight to Designer is that these curbs are tinted. They have painted variations in Argentina to represent where you can park your car, or if you can just stop it by, and things like that. So the tint mask was another reason. So in Designer, I made the texture, spent quite a lot of effort in it to make sure it would look good. And then with that, I had the height map, which I could then feed into the curbs to displace them. But before I actually displaced them, I did some bevels on them at the tops, so they weren't as blocky. But with that done, it was just a matter of subdividing them, displacing them with the height map, and then decimating them using unsubdivide to give a less expensive shape, a simpler shape. I was pretty satisfied with the result there. There was a problem that came with it though, is that I wanted to use unsubdivide as it gave the best results, but Blender fucks up the UVs if the islands of a single object are separate. So I had to re-unwrap the object a few times because of that, but it worked out in the end, I think. By having each curb piece be a single UV, it actually let me to add some extra details in the designer texture without needing to use Substance Painter to do any sort of bakes or external work there. So it was entirely made in Substance Designer, although initially I wanted to work in Painter and I actually spent some time on it. But again, I've mentioned in the beginning of the video, I will not spend much time commenting on the mistakes. But what helped on the curves being a single UV each is that the extremities of the UV island, since they didn't have the bottom face, were exactly the bottom parts of the curves. And in real life, that is the part that there is more wear, or at least a different sort of wear than the other parts of the curves. Firstly, the curves are a bit more faded. Their tinting, their painting is a bit more discolored in the bottom, and also there is a bit more damage. And with the damage, those cavities from the damage, there is a bit more dirt accumulated and so on. So in the end, the process deviated from what I actually planned initially, but overall I think the result ended up being better than if I would have done it the other way. And then what I had actually planned initially was to make that height map, displace it, and then have a low poly, a high poly without decimating the displaced curbs. But when I got to Painter, I realized that it didn't make sense because if I baked a displaced curb, that is the high poly theoretically, into the one that is just a solid color but uses the same texture that has the height map that displays it, I'm just overlaying information on top of information, and that one I'm overlaying on top is lower resolution, so it looked worse in the end, and I just realized that yeah, this is dumb, so I just gave up in Painter entirely. But as again I've said, the overall result in the end was way better. So that's about it regarding the entire process. I think the texture is just what is carrying this whole curve. By me spending extra time perfecting it, it guaranteed that the shape of the final curve and also the color of it, the tinting, everything just worked out. So now what was left was just to import them into the game and then try them in and see how they looked and tweak them if needed. So I'll leave you guys with me just checking the end result in game. I hope you've enjoyed this far, and if you have any thoughts or feedback, please let me know in the comments. And yeah, I forgot to record this final clip with sounds, the in-game sounds, so you can't hear me walking or shooting. I don't think it matters, I don't know, I just do that to test out the models. But, well, that's it. Goodbye.